Ah, if in the name of pity the futile business of procreation was ever to be abolished, the time had surely come to do it. This is a line from one of the most controversial novels of the 19th century, rebours, or Against Nature, by the French novelist Joris-Karl Huysmans. In the English-speaking world though, this novel is most famously known for playing a major role in the trial of Oscar Wilde. Indeed, it is this novel which is hinted at in Wilde's most famous novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. In that novel, Dorian Gray, the protagonist, reads a poisonous French novel which leads to his downfall. That novel was widely believed to be against nature, and this was all but confirmed during Wilde's trial. But beyond the obvious issue that surrounded Wilde's trial, what is it that makes this book so dangerous? I'd like to argue that beyond its association with late 19th century notions of decadence, what makes this novel so dangerous is its life escapism. The novel begins by introducing us to Jean des Esseintes, the final descendant of a once powerful and proud noble lineage, who has led a life of extreme decadence in Paris that has left him deeply disillusioned with society. Without informing anyone, he withdraws to a secluded house near Fontenay, determined to dedicate the remainder of his life to intellectual and aesthetic pursuits. In isolation, des Esseintes fills his house with his eclectic art collection, extensive medieval literature, and other precious artifacts. At the same time, he recalls the various debauched events and love affairs of his past in Paris. Hence, most of the novel consists of memories, interspersed with a vivid description of the protagonist's collections. In this sense, much of the novel is plotless. But despite the lack of plot, we enter the mind of des Esseintes and learn from his dangerous wisdom. And what is this dangerous wisdom? Take this example from the novel. Des Esseintes tries his hand at inventing perfumes, and he creates a garden of poisonous tropical flowers. Illustrating his preference for artifice over nature, a characteristic decadent theme, des Esseintes chooses real flowers that apparently imitate artificial ones. In one of the book's most surreal episodes, he has gemstones set in the shell of a turtle. Unable to bear the dazzling splendor imposed on it, the turtle dies. In another instance, after immersing himself in the novels of Charles Dickens, he plans a trip to London. While waiting for his train, he eats at an English restaurant in Paris and is thrilled by how closely the people match his literary expectations. But satisfied by this experience alone, he abandons his travel plans and heads back home, believing that actually going to London would only lead to disappointment. Over time, his sleepless nights and eccentric eating habits begin to damage his health, forcing him to choose between returning to Paris or facing death. In the book's final lines, he likens his return to society to being a skeptic attempting to find faith in religion. Wait, is that it? Yes, if I had to summarize the book, that's pretty much all that happens on the surface. But what makes this novel such a joy to read are the philosophical ponderings of its protagonist, and, by extension, Huysmans himself. But before delving deeper into the novel, we should ask ourselves, what does the title of the novel really mean? The title rebours has been commonly translated as Against Nature or Against the Grain, but I prefer the former for its broader implications. While being against the grain implies that one goes against the direction of one's contemporaries, and there's quite a lot of that here in the story of des Esseintes, who, as the last in a line of aristocrats, shuts himself up in his grand estate as a revolt against late 19th century bourgeois society and the cultural degeneration he saw coming as a consequence of it. But in a broader sense, I view Huysmans' protagonist, who is ultimately a placeholder for Huysmans himself, as going against nature in his preference for the artificial, for the designed, against the natural or the divine. To elaborate on this earlier theme, consider this scene from the novel, where des Esseintes is designing the bedroom of the house where he will escape from the world. In the other case, and now that he meant to break with the irritating memories of his past life, this was the only one for him. The bedroom had to be turned into a facsimile of a monastery cell, but here difficulties piled up before him, for as far as he was concerned, he categorically refused to put up with the austere ugliness that characterizes all penitential prayer houses. The paradox here, I think, is that he is an artificial monk, a monk who still cares for the aesthetic. This paradox is at the core of Against Nature. While Des Esseintes craves the escape and solitude of monkhood, he lacks the belief that drives true monkhood. In fact, he lacks all belief. The escape that he designs for himself is, in some ways, like an artificial afterlife. Here he sits, surrounded by his books, reflecting on his life experiences, many of them romantic. While he can escape the world, he cannot escape its memory and remains haunted by it. Here is Huysmans' description of the paradox, again in terms of the vocation of the monk. In short, although he had no vocation for the state of grace, he was conscious of a genuine fellow feeling for those who were shut up in religious houses, persecuted by a vindictive society that cannot forgive either the proper contempt they feel for it or their avowed intention of redeeming and expiating by years of silence the ever-increasing licentiousness of its silly, senseless conversations. How does Des Esseintes spend his life in this artificial escape? The chapters of Against Nature are devoted, in sequence, to diverse aesthetic tastes. A chapter devoted to the analysis of French literature, one to music, to paintings, and to perfumes. Interestingly, he reads Christian writings on hermitage for pleasure, and in many of these quite detailed passages, Huysmans' future conversion to Catholicism is evident. He then looked out, as it were, from the summit of his mind over the panorama of the Church and her hereditary influence on humanity down the ages. He pictured her to himself in all her melancholy grandeur, proclaiming to mankind the horror of life, the inclemency of fate, preaching patience, contrition, the spirit of self-sacrifice, endeavoring to salve the sores of men by pointing to the bleeding wounds of Christ, guaranteeing divine privileges and promising the better part of paradise to the afflicted, exhorting the human creature to suffer, to offer to God as a holocaust his tribulations and his offenses, his vicissitudes and his sorrows. He saw her become truly eloquent, speaking words full of sympathy for the poor, full of pity for the oppressed, full of menace for tyrants and oppressors. This takes us to chapter 7, the best part of Against Nature, at least from the perspective of my limited interests. Huysmans' discussion of the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer vis-à-vis Christianity, and his musings on philosophical pessimism in general. Of course, other individuals with other aesthetic interests may resonate with different chapters of Against Nature, and perhaps that is the point. Particular chapters draw in particular people to an admiration of Des Esseintes, and that admiration turns on its head when we see the problems with the way he lives his life. But returning to the discussion of Schopenhauer, Des Esseintes views him, much like I do, as a source of solace, against the religious view of the world, which while sharing his pessimism, takes it all away with their supernatural phenomena of punishment and reward. He, Schopenhauer, did not drum into your ears the revolting dogma of original sin. He did not try to convince you of the superlative goodness of a God who protects the wicked, helps the foolish, crushes the young, brutalizes the old, and chastises the innocent. He did not extol the benefits of a providence which has invented the useless, unjust, incomprehensible, and inept abomination that is physical pain. Yes, it was undoubtedly Schopenhauer who was in the right. What, in fact, were all the evangelical pharmacopoeias compared with his treatises on spiritual hygiene? He claimed no cures, offered the sick no compensation, no hope. But when all was said and done, his theory of pessimism was the great comforter of superior minds and lofty souls. It revealed society as it was. I'm always glad to read the words of a fellow Schopenhauer fanboy. Also interesting to see how he realizes that Schopenhauer is on the same track as Thomas à Kempis in his imitation of Christ. Pessimism is, after all, as the academic Frederick Beiser recognizes in his book Weltschmerz, Christianity without theism. Another space where I see influences of Schopenhauer is in Huysmans' description of the hedgehog dilemma, the simultaneous longing for solitude and community which Schopenhauer discussed at length. Once again, he told himself, the solitude he had longed for so ardently and finally obtained had resulted in appalling unhappiness. while the silence which he had once regarded as well-merited compensation for the nonsense he had listened to for years now weighed unbearably upon him. One morning he had woken up feeling as desperate as a man who finds himself locked in a prison cell. His lips trembled when he tried to speak, his eyes filled with tears, and he choked and spluttered like someone who has been weeping for hours. Possessed by a sudden desire to move about, to look upon a human face, to talk to some other living creature, to share a little in the life of ordinary folk. But this desire is ultimately futile. Des is unable to belong among other people due to his tendency to philosophize about them. See this passage, where observing a few children fighting with each other, he reaches an antinatalist chain of thought, and this continues for several pages, extending beyond the few children in front of him to all of life. The sight put new life into Des. The interest this fight aroused in him took his mind off his own sickly condition. Faced with the savage fury of these vicious brats, he reflected on the cruel and abominable law of the struggle for life, and contemptible though these children were, he could not help feeling sorry for them, and thinking it would have been better for them if their mothers had never borne them. Towards the end of the novel, in a rant about how everything in the world seems to have been ruined, Des recognizes that it is only among the monastics that he could really enjoy any community, but his dwindling, doubtful faith prevents him from even that company. And yet, in spite of everything, it was still only among the ecclesiastics that Des could hope to enjoy relations in some degree of accordance with his tastes. In the company of canons, who were generally men of learning and good breeding, he might have spent some affable and agreeable evenings. But then he would have had to share their beliefs and not oscillate between skeptical ideas and sudden fits of faith, which recurred from time to time under the impulse of his childhood memories. Finally, he realizes, and here Huysmans anticipates his own future conversion, that the wisdom of pessimists like Schopenhauer cannot provide true comfort, and only the church can save him. He realized at last that the arguments of pessimism were powerless to comfort him, that only the impossible belief in a future life could bring him peace of mind. He could no longer shut his eyes to the fact that there was nothing to be done, nothing whatever, that it was all over. Could it be that the terrible god of Genesis and the pale martyr of Golgotha would not prove their existence once for all by renewing the cataclysms of old? By rekindling the rain of fire that once consumed those accursed towns, the cities of the plain? Could it be that this slime would go on spreading until it covered with its pestilential filth this old world, where now only seeds of iniquity sprang up and only harvests of shame were gathered? The reason why I deeply appreciate this novel is because Des is one of the most relatable protagonists I have ever read. In his deep conflict between faith and skepticism, in his distaste for the worldly pleasures of his youth, and in his honest search for meaning. Unlike other readers, I don't view him as fundamentally a quixotic figure, or as a satirical individual, although some portions of this novel, intended for comic effect, may indeed be read this way. But on the whole, this is not a satire. Huysmans in fact did live this way, at least in his mind, if not in his life. The questions of meaning in the face of the death of God that the novel raises continue to the present day. Huysmans made his choice in turning towards religion, but the question of what we turn towards today remains open to us all. And in this sense, I'd like to think that despite all its intricate references to the literature of its time, which is little read today, Against Nature has aged very well and continues to be deeply relevant.